Most people only speak to God when something is breaking, when the money disappears, when the doctor calls, when the relationship collapses, when anxiety becomes too heavy to carry alone in the silence of the night. And in those moments, prayer stops sounding like peace and starts sounding like desperation. People arrive before the divine exhausted, emotionally cornered, spiritually drowning. They speak from panic, from fear, from emptiness. They beg, negotiate, complain, plead for rescue while their minds remain completely fixed upon the very conditions they wish to escape. Why is this happening to me? What did I do wrong? Why won't God help me? When will my life finally change? But there is a hidden truth that few people ever realize. The way you speak to God reveals the state of consciousness you are living from. And according to the great metaphysical teacher Emmet Fox, consciousness is not passive. It is creative. This changes everything, because if consciousness helps shape experience, then prayer is not merely something you say with your lips. Prayer is the mental atmosphere from which your words emerge. Long before you open your mouth, your inner condition is already speaking. And this is why so many people unknowingly pray against themselves. They ask for abundance while emotionally rehearsing scarcity. They ask for peace while mentally feeding fear. They ask for new beginnings while remaining hypnotized by present appearances. They speak to God entirely from the consciousness of lack, and then they wonder why nothing changes. Emmet Fox taught that life conditions often mirror mental conditions, not because God is punishing anyone, not because suffering is deserved, but because the human mind continuously aligns itself with whatever it accepts as true, dominant, and emotionally real. This means that the complaint is not harmless. Complaint is concentration. Complaint is attention fixed upon limitation. Complaint is the subconscious acceptance that appearances possess more authority than divine truth itself. And the mind, once emotionally anchored to limitation, begins filtering reality through that lens everywhere it looks. A person can stand surrounded by opportunity and still experience only absence. They can be loved and still feel abandoned. They can possess resources, intelligence, experience, health, and open doors, yet remain psychologically imprisoned by what appears missing. That is the strange power of consciousness. Whatever dominates the inner world begins shaping the outer experience. This is why two people can walk through the same storm while living in completely different realities. One sees only punishment. The other somehow continues seeing guidance, possibility, strength, unexpected openings, and invisible support. Externally, the storm may be identical. Internally, they are standing in two different worlds. And this brings us to one of the most transformative spiritual practices hidden inside the simplest words imaginable. Thank you, God. Not after life improves, not after the miracle arrives, not after the problem disappears. Before. Before the evidence, before the breakthrough, before the visible answer. Because gratitude, from the metaphysical point of view, is far more than politeness toward heaven. Gratitude is alignment. Gratitude is recognition. Gratitude is a refusal to allow appearances to become the final authority over consciousness. The grateful mind sees differently, and what the mind sees differently, it eventually experiences differently. There are people who spend years praying for doors to open while remaining mentally devoted to fear, resentment, complaint, and emotional exhaustion. They unknowingly close within themselves the very channel through which peace, guidance, intuition, opportunity, and divine supply attempt to flow. Then there are others who discover a deeper law, a law so simple that most people overlook it completely. Before asking for anything, give thanks for something. Even now, even here, even in difficulty, especially in difficulty. Because the moment gratitude appears, consciousness begins to shift. And when consciousness shifts, reality slowly begins shifting with it. Chapter 1. The Consciousness of Lack. There is a way of looking at life that slowly drains the spirit without most people ever noticing it. It does not arrive dramatically. It does not announce itself with noise. It develops quietly, through repetition, through habit, through years of unconsciously training the mind to focus more on what is absent than on what is present. And eventually, without realizing it, many people begin living inside what Emmet would call a consciousness of lack. This is far deeper than simply having financial problems or facing temporary difficulty. A consciousness of lack is an inner atmosphere, a mental condition, a way of interpreting reality itself. Two people may possess the same amount of money, the same opportunities, even the same external conditions, and yet one lives emotionally supported by life while the other feels permanently deprived. Because lack is not always a material condition. Very often, it is a psychological fixation. A person trapped in this state begins every morning by noticing what is wrong first. What is missing? What has not happened yet? What still hurts? What still feels unfair? Attention becomes magnetized toward incompleteness, and whatever consistently dominates attention eventually begins shaping identity. This is one of the great metaphysical truths that Emmet spent his life teaching. Consciousness is creative. The mind is not merely observing reality from a distance, it continuously participates in the way reality is experienced. The outer world affects the mind, yes, but the mind also filters, interprets, organizes, and emotionally charges the outer world in return. Most people never question the atmosphere of thought they live inside every day. They simply accept it. If they feel defeated, they assume defeat must be the truth. If they feel afraid, they assume danger must be everywhere. If they feel unsupported, they begin interpreting life itself as withholding. And little by little, the mind becomes conditioned to search for evidence confirming its deepest emotional assumptions. This is why some people can receive 10 blessings and still remain emotionally attached to the one thing they do not have. The consciousness of lack is never satisfied because it has trained itself to notice absence more quickly than presence. It becomes spiritually blind to what already exists. A roof becomes invisible because the mind only sees the unpaid bill. Health becomes invisible because the mind focuses only on exhaustion. Love becomes invisible because one relationship failed. Opportunity becomes invisible because fear magnifies uncertainty. The tragedy is not merely emotional suffering. The tragedy is perceptual distortion, because once the mind becomes emotionally loyal to limitation, it stops recognizing openings that were always there. This is why two people can experience the exact same circumstance and walk away with completely different futures. One sees only the obstacle, the other sees instruction, redirection, and hidden possibility. One collapses internally, the other reorganizes consciousness. And over time, these internal differences become external realities. Emmet repeatedly emphasized that conditions often follow mental patterns, not magically, not mechanically, but because thought influences behavior, perception, emotional resilience, decision-making, expectation, and spiritual receptivity. The person who believes life is permanently against them begins unconsciously cooperating with that assumption. They hesitate more, trust less, notice fewer opportunities, interpret neutral situations negatively, expect disappointment before action even begins, and then they call the result fate. But consciousness was involved from the beginning. This is why a complaint is far more dangerous than most people realize. People think complaining is simply an emotional release, a harmless reaction to difficulty. But metaphysically, complaint becomes sustained attention upon limitation. And attention is powerful. Whatever the mind continuously circles around begins gaining emotional weight, psychological authority, and spiritual influence within consciousness. The mind becomes shaped by what it repeatedly rehearses. If a person spends years saying, "Nothing ever works for me. I'm always struggling. Life is unfair. Everything goes wrong," those statements eventually stop feeling like temporary emotions and begin solidifying into identity. This is the hidden danger. Human beings become what they emotionally repeat. Not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually. The subconscious mind absorbs repeated emotional impressions with extraordinary obedience. It does not carefully analyze every statement for objective truth. It responds to emotional conviction, repetition, and focus. And eventually, the inner world begins organizing itself around limitation. This is why some people feel emotionally exhausted, even during periods where life is objectively improving. Their external conditions changed faster than their consciousness did. They escape the circumstance, but not the mental atmosphere. And this is where gratitude begins to become spiritually revolutionary. Because gratitude interrupts the hypnosis of lack. The grateful mind cannot remain fully fixated upon absence while simultaneously recognizing presence. The two states oppose each other. One contracts consciousness, the other expands it. This does not mean grateful people never suffer. They do. It does not mean spiritually aligned people never feel pain, fear, uncertainty, or grief. They absolutely do, but they refuse to allow pain to become the only thing consciousness recognizes as real. That refusal changes everything, because the moment the mind begins noticing what still remains, instead of worshipping what appears missing, perception starts shifting. And perception is never a small thing. Perception shapes emotional reality. Perception shapes expectation. Perception shapes decisions. Perception shapes energy. Perception shapes behavior. Perception shapes what the mind even allows itself to see. A person who constantly says, "There is nothing left for me," will unconsciously stop noticing open doors. But a person who says, "There is still life here, there is still a possibility here, there is still good that remains," begins mentally cooperating with expansion instead of collapse. This is why gratitude is not weakness, it is not denial, it is not pretending life is perfect. Gratitude is a deliberate reorientation of consciousness toward divine presence instead of psychological imprisonment inside appearances. And according to Emmet, appearances are never the highest truth. Conditions change, circumstances move, storms pass. Doors open unexpectedly, opportunities appear suddenly, guidance emerges quietly. But consciousness determines whether a person is spiritually available to recognize these things when they arrive. A fearful mind often misses what a grateful mind immediately sees. And perhaps this is why so many people remain trapped in cycles they desperately want to escape, not because God abandoned them, but because their attention became so emotionally fused with limitation that they stopped recognizing the invisible movements of life still unfolding around them. The consciousness of lack narrows the world. Gratitude opens it again. Chapter 2. Why complaint blocks divine supply. One of the most misunderstood ideas in metaphysical spirituality is the nature of divine supply. Most people imagine supply as something distant, something external, something that arrives only through favorable circumstances, financial improvement, lucky opportunities, or the approval of the outside world. But according to the teachings of Emmet, divine supply is not created by human conditions. It exists prior to them. This is a radical idea. It means that life itself is not fundamentally built upon limitation, but upon flow, upon intelligence, upon infinite possibility continuously expressing itself through creation. The blockage is rarely the absence of supply. The blockage is usually the state of consciousness through which life is being interpreted. And this is why complaint becomes spiritually dangerous, not because God punishes negativity, not because human beings must pretend to feel happy all the time, but because a complaint slowly conditions consciousness to emotionally cooperate with limitation. Most people never notice this process happening. They think they are merely describing reality. I'm exhausted. Nothing changes. There's never enough. Life keeps getting worse. Everything is against me. But the subconscious mind does not always distinguish between observation and identification. Repeated emotional statements become internal instructions, and eventually, the mind begins organizing perception around them. This is why some individuals become psychologically trapped inside problems long after solutions begin appearing around them. Their consciousness has adapted to limitation so completely that the mind filters out evidence inconsistent with its emotional expectations. This happens constantly in human life. A person receives help, yet only notices what is still missing. An opportunity appears, yet fear immediately magnifies the risk. A door opens, yet the mind remains emotionally loyal to disappointment, and little by little, the individual unknowingly develops resistance to the very good they claim to desire. This is one of the deepest metaphysical insights behind the idea of gratitude. Gratitude is not simply feeling thankful after receiving something. Gratitude is the interruption of resistance. It is the conscious refusal to let appearances become mentally absolute. Because appearances are always incomplete. The human mind tends to believe that what it sees in the present moment represents the final truth of reality. But appearances are temporary conditions moving through time. They shift constantly. They evolve. They dissolve. They reorganize. Yet most people psychologically freeze themselves inside present conditions as though the current moment possesses permanent authority. This is why fear becomes so convincing. A person loses money and immediately concludes, "My future is collapsing." A relationship ends and the mind whispers, "I will always be alone." The body becomes tired and consciousness declares, "I am broken." Notice what happened. Temporary conditions became identity, and once consciousness fuses itself emotionally with limitation, perception narrows dramatically. This narrowing affects everything. Creativity decreases, intuition weakens, hope fades, mental flexibility collapses, faith becomes difficult, solutions become invisible. Not because life stopped moving, but because fear reduced consciousness into survival fixation. This is why spiritually exhausted people often feel trapped, even when pathways still exist around them. The mind becomes so consumed with what appears absent that it loses sensitivity to what remains available. Emmet repeatedly taught that divine life is always present, always active, always expressing itself. The problem is that human beings often become mentally unavailable to perceive it, and the complaint deepens this unavailability, because a complaint fixes emotional attention upon obstruction. The mind begins rehearsing the problem repeatedly. What went wrong? Who caused it? What is unfair? What is missing? Why nothing changes? And whatever consciousness rehearses continuously gains psychological power. Eventually, the problem grows larger internally than it exists externally. This is why two people can experience the same setback while producing entirely different futures from it. One collapses inwardly and builds identity around defeat. The other experiences pain, yes, but refuses to emotionally crown the condition as final truth. That difference changes everything, because consciousness determines receptivity. A mind consumed by resentment struggles to recognize opportunity. A mind consumed by fear struggles to recognize guidance. A mind consumed by complaint struggles to recognize supply, not because supply disappeared, but because consciousness became occupied elsewhere. This is why gratitude is spiritually powerful even before circumstances improve. The moment gratitude appears, consciousness begins reopening. The mind softens, perception expands, attention shifts. Emotional rigidity loosens, and suddenly the individual begins noticing things that fear had previously concealed. A possibility, an idea, a connection, a hidden strength, a new direction, a small opening that was invisible before. This is not fantasy. Human perception is deeply influenced by emotional state. Modern psychology understands this partially through concepts like selective attention and cognitive filtering. The mind naturally notices more of whatever it has been emotionally conditioned to prioritize. Fear prioritizes danger. Scarcity prioritizes absence. Complaint prioritizes obstacles. But gratitude prioritizes presence. And presence changes the entire experience of reality. This does not mean grateful people never struggle financially, emotionally, or physically. They do, but they stop worshipping appearances. That is the difference. They stop treating temporary conditions as the ultimate truth. Instead of saying, "There is nothing left," they begin saying, "Good still exists here." And that single shift changes the internal atmosphere through which life is experienced. A grateful person may still have unanswered prayers, but psychologically, spiritually, and emotionally, they are no longer standing in the exact same place. Because gratitude quietly restores a relationship with possibility, and possibility is where divine supply begins entering consciousness again. Perhaps this is why some people pray endlessly, yet remain emotionally closed, while others seem to encounter guidance, support, opportunities, and unexpected openings almost mysteriously. Not because God plays favorites, but because consciousness determines what the individual becomes available to receive, and complaint, when repeated long enough, slowly closes that inner door. Gratitude opens it again. Chapter 3. Gratitude as a spiritual law. Most people think gratitude is an emotion, something gentle, something polite, something appropriate after life gives them what they wanted. But from the metaphysical perspective taught by Emmet, gratitude is far more than an emotional reaction. It is spiritual alignment. And this distinction changes the entire meaning of prayer, faith, and even the way human beings experience reality itself. Because if gratitude only appears after external conditions improve, then consciousness remains permanently dependent upon appearances for inner peace. The person says, "I will feel thankful when things finally change." But this creates a hidden trap. It means the external world now controls the internal state. The mind becomes emotionally obedient to circumstances. If conditions improve, gratitude appears. If conditions worsen, fear returns. If problems arise, consciousness collapses again into anxiety, complaint, and emotional exhaustion. This creates a life of permanent instability because the individual never learns how to establish consciousness independently from appearances. And according to Emmet, appearances are always temporary. They shift constantly. They rise and fall. They move like weather. A person who builds consciousness entirely upon external conditions will eventually experience emotional chaos because the outer world itself is unstable by nature. This is why gratitude becomes spiritually transformative. Gratitude allows consciousness to reconnect with something deeper than temporary appearances. It trains the mind to recognize presence even in incomplete moments. And recognition changes perception. This is one of the greatest hidden truths of human psychology. People do not experience reality only through circumstances. They experience reality through interpretation. Two individuals may stand in the exact same life condition while internally living in completely different worlds. One person sees delay, punishment, abandonment, unfairness. The other sees preparation, redirection, growth, hidden possibility. Externally, nothing has changed yet. Internally, everything changed. And because consciousness shapes behavior, emotion, expectation, resilience, and spiritual receptivity, these internal interpretations slowly begin producing different outcomes over time. This is why gratitude is not passive, it is creative. The grateful mind sees more because it is not psychologically imprisoned by fear alone. Fear narrows attention. Gratitude expands it. Fear becomes obsessed with what is missing. Gratitude recognizes what still remains. And whatever consciousness repeatedly recognizes gains emotional reality within the mind. Modern psychology partially understands this through selective attention. Human beings constantly filter enormous amounts of information every second. The mind cannot consciously process everything simultaneously, so it prioritizes what appears emotionally important. A fearful person notices danger quickly. An insecure person notices rejection quickly. A resentful person notices offense quickly. In the same way, a grateful person begins noticing support, opportunity, beauty, guidance, kindness, strength, and possibility more naturally. Not because life suddenly became perfect, but because consciousness changed its orientation. This is why gratitude often appears miraculous to people who practice it sincerely. The external world may not transform overnight, but perception immediately begins reorganizing itself. And perception changes experience. A person trapped in scarcity consciousness walks into a room, seeing only limitation. What they lack, who has more, what could go wrong, why success feels distant. But someone practicing gratitude enters the same room, noticing possibilities, resources, connections, ideas, openings. The difference is not intelligence, the difference is consciousness. And consciousness affects everything. This is why Emmet repeatedly emphasized the importance of mental atmosphere. The state of mind a person repeatedly inhabits eventually influences not only emotional health, but decision-making, energy, resilience, and spiritual awareness. The grateful mind becomes more receptive because it is less internally contracted. Fear contracts consciousness, resentment contracts consciousness, complaint contracts consciousness, but gratitude opens it. This opening matters more than most people realize, because life often enters through openings the fearful mind cannot perceive. An opportunity appears quietly. A conversation changes direction unexpectedly. An intuitive idea arrives suddenly. A chance encounter alters a future. A hidden strength awakens during difficulty. But when consciousness remains emotionally consumed by fear and lack, these subtle movements frequently go unnoticed. The mind becomes too preoccupied with surviving psychologically to perceive what life is attempting to reveal. This is why gratitude before evidence is one of the most powerful spiritual acts a human being can perform. Not because gratitude manipulates God, but because gratitude transforms the person offering it. The grateful individual begins emotionally cooperating with possibility instead of emotionally worshipping limitation. And this changes the inner environment from which prayer emerges. Most people pray while internally convinced that life is against them. That contradiction weakens faith before words are even spoken. But gratitude restores connection with trust, not blind optimism, not denial. Trust. The quiet recognition that divine life may still be operating beyond present appearances. This is why spiritually mature people often remain calm during seasons that emotionally destroy others. It is not because they never feel pain. It is because they trained consciousness differently. They refuse to allow temporary appearances to define ultimate reality. And slowly, this changes the way they move through the world. A grateful person speaks differently, thinks differently, notices differently, responds differently. Even the nervous system begins changing. Fear keeps the body in constant contraction, constant anticipation, constant survival orientation. But gratitude softens internal resistance. Breathing slows, awareness widens, mental rigidity decreases. The body begins leaving survival mode. And from this calmer state, intuition becomes clearer, creativity returns, emotional resilience increases, solutions become easier to perceive. Again, not because gratitude magically erases all problems, but because consciousness is no longer completely consumed by them. This is why gratitude is not weakness. It is one of the highest forms of spiritual intelligence, because the grateful mind understands something the fearful mind forgets. Appearances are not final. Conditions move, doors open, help appears, insight arrives, strength develops. Life reorganizes itself constantly, and gratitude keeps consciousness connected to this movement instead of psychologically freezing inside present difficulty. Perhaps this is why some people continue finding light even in dark seasons, not because they are spared hardship, but because they learned how to keep consciousness aligned with presence instead of surrendering completely to appearances. And once gratitude becomes more than an occasional emotion, once it becomes a way of seeing, the entire relationship between the human mind and reality begins changing from within. Chapter 4. The way you speak to God matters. Most people believe prayer is measured by words, by how beautiful they sound, how emotional they become, how intensely they are spoken, how desperately they are repeated. But the deeper metaphysical traditions teach something entirely different. Prayer is not measured primarily by language. Prayer is measured by consciousness. And this is one of the most life-changing realizations a human being can discover, because it means that two people can say the exact same words while internally standing in completely different spiritual conditions. One person says, "God, help me," from panic. Another says, "God, guide me," from trust. The words may appear similar externally, but the consciousness beneath them is entirely different. And according to Emmet, consciousness is the true creative force shaping human experience. This is why the way you speak to God matters, not because God is emotionally sensitive to wording, but because the language a person repeatedly uses reveals the atmosphere of mind they continue living inside. A fearful mind speaks differently than a grateful one. A consciousness imprisoned by appearances prays differently than a consciousness aligned with divine presence. And over time, these differences shape emotional reality itself. Many people unknowingly pray from emotional collapse. Their prayer becomes a rehearsal of fear. Everything is going wrong. I can't survive this. Nothing ever changes. I don't know what to do anymore. Notice what happens psychologically. The mind is not merely expressing pain, it is deepening identification with helplessness. And the subconscious mind absorbs this emotional repetition constantly. Eventually, the individual stops temporarily experiencing fear and begins unconsciously building an identity around it. This is why many people leave prayer feeling emotionally unchanged. They approached prayer hoping for relief while remaining mentally fused with the very consciousness producing their suffering. They asked for peace while emotionally feeding fear. They asked for abundance while mentally rehearsing lack. They asked for guidance while internally expecting abandonment. And because consciousness remained unchanged, perception remained unchanged. This is one of the central metaphysical ideas behind the teachings of Emmet. Outer transformation begins with inner reorientation. Not a denial of difficulty, reorientation. The fearful mind continuously magnifies appearances until temporary conditions begin to feel absolute. But faith, operates differently. Faith does not mean pretending problems do not exist. Faith means refusing to emotionally worship them. This distinction is enormous. A person trapped in fear speaks to God as though darkness is final. But a consciousness rooted in trust speaks differently, even during pain, even during uncertainty, even before visible answers appear. Instead of, "There is nothing left," the grateful mind quietly says, "Good still exists here." Instead of, "My life is collapsing," it says, "I cannot fully see the path yet, but divine intelligence has not abandoned me." This is not naive positivity, it is a spiritual discipline, because the mind naturally gravitates toward fear during uncertainty. Human beings instinctively focus on danger, absence, and worst-case outcomes. Survival conditioning has trained the nervous system to prioritize threat. And this is why consciously shifting the way one speaks becomes spiritually powerful. Language reinforces consciousness. Every repeated statement strengthens a particular emotional reality within the mind. A person who constantly says, "I'm broken," begins emotionally organizing identity around weakness. A person who constantly says, "Nothing works for me," conditions consciousness toward the expectation of failure. But someone who repeatedly recognizes, "Life still supports me in ways I cannot fully see," begins strengthening an entirely different inner atmosphere. This does not instantly erase external problems, but it changes the internal state from which the individual confronts those problems, and consciousness affects everything: resilience, clarity, creativity, intuition, emotional endurance, perception, openness to opportunity. This is why spiritually grounded individuals often appear calm in circumstances that emotionally overwhelm others, not because they never feel fear, but because they trained themselves not to surrender consciousness completely to appearances. Most people allow appearances to dictate inner reality. If money disappears, they immediately internalize defeat. If rejection occurs, they internalize worthlessness. If uncertainty appears, they internalize catastrophe. But spiritually disciplined individuals interrupt this process. They feel pain, yes, but they refuse to emotionally conclude that temporary conditions represent the ultimate truth. And this changes the energy of prayer itself. Prayer stops becoming desperate begging and starts becoming conscious alignment. This is exactly why gratitude before asking becomes so powerful. The moment a person says, "Thank you, God," before discussing the problem, consciousness immediately shifts away from total fixation upon limitation. The mind begins remembering what still exists, what still functions, what still remains beautiful, what has already been provided, what strength still survives internally. And suddenly, prayer emerges from a different place. Not complete fear, not emotional starvation, but recognition. This is the hidden power behind the simple practice of giving thanks before making requests. It breaks psychological hypnosis, because fear narrows consciousness until the mind sees only the problem. Gratitude widens consciousness again. A person may still have unpaid bills, but now they also recognize experience, intelligence, relationships, resilience, opportunity, breath, life itself. And that recognition changes emotional posture. The body softens, the mind opens, the nervous system settles slightly. Hopelessness loosens its grip. This is not imaginary. The state of consciousness from which a person speaks directly affects emotional physiology. Fear contracts the body. Gratitude relaxes it. And a relaxed consciousness perceives more clearly than a contracted one. This is why some of the greatest spiritual teachers throughout history emphasized thanksgiving so deeply. Not because gratitude flatters God, but because gratitude transforms the one who practices it. The grateful person becomes psychologically available to possibilities again, and possibility is where faith begins breathing. Perhaps this is why so many prayers feel powerless, not because heaven stopped listening, but because the individual remained emotionally convinced that darkness possessed greater authority than divine presence itself. And consciousness always moves toward what it accepts as most real. This is why the way you speak to God matters, because eventually, the way you speak to God becomes the way you speak to life, and the way you speak to life slowly becomes the way you experience it. Chapter 5. The Practice of the Three Thank Yous. There are moments in life when the mind becomes so overwhelmed by a problem that it loses the ability to see anything beyond it. A financial crisis, a broken relationship, a period of loneliness, a body exhausted by stress, a future that suddenly feels uncertain. In these moments, human consciousness naturally contracts. Attention narrows around pain, fear, and survival. The mind becomes emotionally consumed by what appears missing, threatened, or falling apart. And this is why most people begin prayer from a state of inner collapse. They immediately focus on what they lost, what they fear, what is not working, what still hurts, what they desperately need to change. Without realizing it, they approach life entirely through the consciousness of absence. But one of the simplest and most transformative spiritual disciplines, inspired by the teachings of Emmet begins with a radical interruption of this mental pattern. Before asking for anything, give thanks for three things first. Simple, quiet, almost deceptively simple, and yet this small act has the power to shift the entire atmosphere of consciousness. Because gratitude changes the position from which the mind experiences reality. Most people believe gratitude is merely a reaction to favorable conditions. They assume thankfulness comes after the breakthrough, after the healing, after the answer arrives. But metaphysically, gratitude is powerful precisely because it appears before external evidence fully changes. The moment a person consciously searches for something to appreciate, the mind begins moving away from total fixation upon limitation. And this movement matters more than most people realize. Imagine someone who has just lost their job. Immediately, fear begins speaking internally. Everything is falling apart. I'm running out of time. Nothing ever works for me. I'm not safe anymore. Notice how quickly the mind transforms temporary conditions into emotional identity. The person is no longer simply facing uncertainty. They begin to feel uncertainty internally. And once consciousness fuses emotionally with fear, perception changes dramatically. The mind becomes less capable of recognizing possibilities because survival thinking dominates attention. But now imagine the individual pauses before spiraling deeper into fear and says, "Thank God I still have my health. Thank God for the experience I've already gained. Thank God there are still people who support me." The external situation has not changed yet. The job has not returned. The uncertainty has not disappeared. The future may still feel unclear, but consciousness has already started shifting, and that shift is where transformation begins. Because gratitude interrupts psychological paralysis. The mind starts remembering capability, resilience, support, previous victories, remaining strength. Instead of seeing only collapse, consciousness begins to perceive continuity. This is one of the deepest hidden powers of gratitude. It restores access to possibility, and possibility changes everything. Consider another example. A person suddenly faces financial pressure after their car breaks down. Fear immediately rushes in. Why does this always happen to me? I can never move forward. Life keeps getting harder. Again, attention collapses entirely around frustration and limitation. But before surrendering completely to emotional reaction, the person practices the three thank yous. Thank God I even have transportation. Thank God there are still ways to solve this. Thank God I've survived difficult seasons before. Notice what changes, not the circumstance, the consciousness confronting the circumstance. And according to metaphysical teaching, consciousness deeply affects how reality is experienced. A fearful mind sees fewer options. A grateful mind sees more. This is not imagination. Human perception genuinely changes according to emotional orientation. Modern psychology understands this partially through selective attention and cognitive filtering. The mind notices more of whatever it has been emotionally conditioned to focus upon. Fear conditions the mind toward danger. Scarcity conditions the mind toward absence. Complaint conditions the mind toward obstacles. But gratitude conditions the mind toward presence. And presence reconnects consciousness with life itself. This becomes even more important during emotional suffering. There are moments when people feel internally exhausted by anxiety, grief, disappointment, or loneliness. In those seasons, consciousness can become so darkened by emotional pain that the individual temporarily loses connection with meaning altogether. The mind whispers, "Nothing matters anymore. I can't keep doing this. Everything feels empty." And yet even here, gratitude remains powerful, not because it denies suffering, but because it prevents suffering from becoming the only reality consciousness recognizes. Imagine someone sitting alone at night, emotionally overwhelmed, unable to see a way forward. Instead of feeding despair endlessly, they pause and quietly say, "Thank God for another day of life. Thank God there are still people who care about me. Thank God I still have another chance to begin again." The pain may still exist, but hopelessness loosens slightly. And spiritually speaking, even a small opening matters, because light enters through openings. This is why gratitude before asking becomes such a transformative spiritual discipline. It shifts prayer away from emotional starvation and toward recognition. Recognition of life, breath, lessons learned, unseen, strength, quiet forms of support, possibilities not yet visible, divine presence still operating beneath appearances. And recognition changes the internal atmosphere completely. Many people spend years unconsciously training themselves to notice only what is wrong. Over time, this creates a form of spiritual blindness. The individual becomes unable to perceive the subtle ways life continues supporting them every single day. Gratitude restores vision. It teaches consciousness to recognize what fear had concealed. And once the mind begins reconnecting with presence, instead of worshipping absence, emotional reality starts changing from within. The individual becomes calmer, more open, more resilient, more perceptive, more spiritually receptive. Not because all problems instantly disappear, but because consciousness is no longer completely imprisoned by them. This is why the 3 thank yous practice is far more than positive thinking. It is a reorientation of consciousness away from limitation and back toward divine life. And according to the deepest metaphysical teachings, every outer transformation begins with an inner shift first. Perhaps this is why gratitude has quietly changed so many lives throughout history. Not because gratitude manipulates God, but because gratitude transforms the mind that practices it. And once consciousness changes, the individual begins moving through reality differently, seeing differently, speaking differently, praying differently, responding differently. All because before asking for more, they first learned how to recognize what had already been given. Chapter 6. Gratitude during darkness. It is easy to feel grateful when life feels generous, when the body is healthy, when relationships feel secure, when money flows easily, when the future appears bright and predictable. In those moments, gratitude feels natural because the mind has visible evidence supporting emotional ease. But the true spiritual power of gratitude is not revealed during seasons of comfort. It is revealed in the darkness, during uncertainty, during emotional exhaustion, during unanswered prayers, during moments when life appears silent. Because anyone can say, "Thank you," after receiving what they wanted. The deeper question is, can consciousness remain open before the visible answer arrives? This is where gratitude transforms from a simple emotion into spiritual strength. According to Emmet, appearances are never the final truth of reality. Conditions change constantly. Situations evolve. What seems immovable today may disappear tomorrow. What appears lost may return in another form entirely. But the human mind rarely experiences life this way. Instead, people tend to emotionally absolutize temporary conditions. A difficult season begins, and the mind immediately concludes, "This is my life now." A painful experience occurs, and consciousness whispers, "Things will never improve." Fear takes present appearances and projects them infinitely into the future. And this is why darkness becomes psychologically dangerous, not only because of the pain itself, but because prolonged suffering tempts consciousness to surrender entirely to hopelessness. Once hopelessness takes root, perception narrows dramatically. The individual stops expecting help, stops recognizing possibilities, stops trusting life, stops believing change is possible, and eventually, many people become emotionally loyal to despair without realizing it. This is why gratitude during difficult seasons is so spiritually powerful, because gratitude interrupts the mind's tendency to turn temporary pain into permanent identity. It quietly reminds consciousness, this moment is not the whole story. That reminder matters more than most people realize. Imagine someone walking through a season of profound uncertainty. Nothing seems stable anymore. The future feels unclear. Emotionally, they feel exhausted from carrying an invisible weight every day. The mind naturally begins searching for evidence confirming fear. What is failing? What might collapse? What could go wrong next? And little by little, life itself begins appearing hostile. But then the individual pauses and says, "Thank God I am still here. Thank God strength still exists inside me. Thank God this pain has not destroyed my spirit." Notice the shift. The darkness has not disappeared, but consciousness is no longer completely consumed by it. And that changes the internal experience of suffering profoundly. Because gratitude creates psychological space between the individual and the pain they are experiencing. Without that space, suffering easily becomes identity. People stop saying, "I am facing difficulty," and begin unconsciously saying, "I am broken." This is one of the hidden dangers of emotional pain. The mind slowly fuses the self with the condition, but gratitude restores separation. It reminds consciousness that beyond the fear, beyond the uncertainty, beyond the temporary appearance, life still exists. Presence still exists. Divine intelligence still exists. And from a metaphysical perspective, this recognition reopens spiritual receptivity. Fear closes consciousness. Gratitude opens it again. This does not mean grateful people avoid grief, sadness, or emotional struggle. They do not. Spiritual maturity is not emotional numbness. In fact, many deeply grateful people feel pain intensely because they remain emotionally awake to life. But they refuse to allow suffering to become the supreme authority over consciousness. This is the difference. Most people unconsciously crown appearances as the absolute truth. If the situation looks hopeless, they emotionally accept hopelessness. If circumstances feel unstable, they internalize instability. If pain arrives, consciousness becomes consumed entirely by pain. But spiritually disciplined individuals learn something different. They learn how to hold awareness of difficulty without surrendering completely to it. And gratitude helps create that balance. Because gratitude does not deny darkness, It simply refuses to deny light at the same time. This distinction is essential. Many people misunderstand spiritual teachings because they assume gratitude means pretending everything is perfect. But true gratitude is not denial, it is recognition. Recognition that even during difficult seasons, breath still exists, life still exists, possibility still exists, strength still exists, growth may still be unfolding invisibly. And this recognition changes the nervous system itself. Fear places the body into contraction, survival mode, emotional rigidity. The mind becomes hyper-focused on danger, and the body responds accordingly. Tension increases, breathing shortens, sleep weakens, mental clarity decreases. But gratitude softens this contraction. Not instantly, not completely, but enough for consciousness to breathe again. And once consciousness breathes, perception begins reopening. A new idea appears. A conversation changes something internally. An unexpected opportunity emerges quietly. Hope returns gradually. Strength reorganizes itself from within. This is why many people later look back on their darkest seasons and realize those moments transformed them more deeply than periods of comfort ever did. Because darkness often strips away illusions, it reveals emotional dependencies, unconscious fears, false identities, hidden exhaustion, misplaced trust in external conditions. And when gratitude survives even there, inside uncertainty, inside pain, inside unanswered questions, it begins producing an entirely different kind of consciousness. A consciousness no longer dependent upon circumstances for inner stability. This is one of the highest forms of spiritual maturity, not forcing happiness, not suppressing pain, but remaining inwardly connected to divine presence even when appearances remain unresolved. Perhaps this is why some individuals emerge from difficult seasons wiser, calmer, stronger, and more spiritually alive, while others remain psychologically trapped inside the experience long after the external condition has ended. One surrendered consciousness completely to darkness. The other continued protecting a small inner connection to light. And often, that small inner light becomes the beginning of transformation itself, because gratitude during darkness is more than emotional resilience. It is an act of spiritual remembrance, a quiet refusal to forget that, beyond temporary appearances, life is still moving, even when the human eye cannot yet fully see where it is leading. Chapter 7. Why some people seem to receive more from life. There are people who move through life carrying an invisible heaviness, and there are others who, even during difficulty, seem strangely supported by something deeper. Opportunities appear around them unexpectedly. Help arrives at the right moment. New doors open after old ones close. Strength emerges during seasons that should have destroyed them emotionally. To the outside world, it can almost seem mysterious. Some call it luck, others call it favor, others call it a coincidence. But from the metaphysical perspective taught by Emmet, there is often something far deeper happening beneath the surface. Because life does not respond only to external effort. Life also responds to consciousness, and consciousness determines what a person becomes inwardly available to receive. This idea can initially feel uncomfortable because most people have been conditioned to think only in terms of external conditions. They assume reality is shaped entirely by circumstances outside themselves. But two individuals can stand before the same opportunity and experience completely different outcomes. Not only because of skill or intelligence, but because of the inner atmosphere through which they interpret life itself. One person sees a possibility, the other sees danger. One sees expansion, the other sees inevitable disappointment. And over time, these inner interpretations begin shaping behavior, energy, emotional resilience, expectation, and perception in profound ways. This is why some people unconsciously block the very things they claim to desire, not intentionally, but psychologically, spiritually, emotionally. A person may say they want abundance while internally remaining devoted to fear. They may pray for peace while rehearsing anxiety every day. They may ask for new beginnings while remaining emotionally identified with old pain. And this creates an inner contradiction. The conscious mind asks for change, but the deeper emotional atmosphere resists it. This is one of the reasons gratitude becomes so powerful. Gratitude dissolves resistance. Not instantly, not perfectly, but gradually. The grateful mind stops fighting reality long enough to perceive it more clearly. Many people move through life in a constant state of internal contraction. They expect disappointment before action begins. They anticipate rejection before connection occurs. They emotionally prepare for failure before opportunity fully appears. And because the mind continuously searches for evidence supporting its dominant emotional assumptions, these individuals unknowingly reinforce the very realities they fear most. This is why two people can receive the same opportunity while only one recognizes its value. Consciousness filters experience. A fearful mind often dismisses possibilities quickly. That won't work. Nothing ever changes. I'll probably fail. People like me never succeed. These thoughts appear harmless because they happen internally. But repeated internal language slowly shapes emotional identity. Eventually, the individual stops temporarily doubting themselves and begins unconsciously becoming doubt itself. And doubt changes behavior. The person hesitates more, trusts less, withdraws emotionally, avoids risk, stops noticing openings. Then life appears to confirm their fears, not because the universe is punishing them, but because consciousness influences participation in reality. This is why spiritually grounded individuals often appear more receptive to life. Their consciousness remains more open, not naive, not blind to difficulty. Open. They expect possibilities more naturally. They recover emotionally faster after setbacks. They notice support more easily. They remain psychologically available to opportunity. And gratitude helps cultivate this openness, because gratitude trains consciousness to recognize what still works, instead of obsessing exclusively over what appears broken. A grateful person walking through difficulty may still acknowledge pain honestly, but internally they continue reinforcing the connection with life, possibility, resilience, support, divine presence. And this changes their relationship with reality itself. People often underestimate the importance of expectation, but expectation quietly shapes perception every single day. A person who expects betrayal notices reasons to distrust quickly. A person who expects failure notices obstacles immediately. A person who expects scarcity emotionally magnifies what is missing. But someone who expects life to continue unfolding possibilities, even during uncertainty, moves through the world differently. They remain inwardly receptive, and receptivity matters because many blessings enter quietly, not dramatically. An idea arrives unexpectedly, a conversation shifts direction, a new relationship appears, a hidden talent awakens, a sudden realization changes perspective. An opportunity emerges from what once looked like failure. But a mind consumed entirely by fear often misses these subtle movements. This is why gratitude changes more than emotion. It changes attention. And attention determines what consciousness becomes capable of seeing. Most people spend years unconsciously training their minds to focus on problems first. Eventually, this creates a perception pattern where absence becomes emotionally louder than presence. The individual stops noticing progress, support, guidance, beauty, growth, possibility. And without realizing it, They begin emotionally disconnecting themselves from life. But gratitude restores connection. It reminds us that even during imperfection, life continues offering. Breath, lessons, relationships, opportunities, inner strength, moments of grace. This recognition softens inner resistance, and once resistance softens, receptivity increases. This is why some individuals seem to receive more from life. Not because they are more worthy, not because God loves them more, but because they gradually learned how to remain inwardly available to possibility instead of emotionally imprisoning themselves inside fear. This does not mean they never suffer. They do. It does not mean they never doubt themselves. They do. But they refuse to make fear the center of consciousness, and over time, this creates a completely different relationship with reality. The grateful mind continues moving. The fearful mind contracts. The receptive mind notices openings. The resistant mind notices walls. And eventually, these internal differences begin shaping entirely different lives. Perhaps this is why gratitude has always been emphasized so deeply in spiritual traditions throughout history. Not because gratitude flatters heaven, but because gratitude expands consciousness enough for human beings to recognize what fear was preventing them from seeing all along. Chapter 8. Before you ask, give thanks. There comes a moment in every human life when external solutions stop being enough. A moment when achievement no longer guarantees peace, when control becomes impossible, when the future refuses to obey personal plans, when the mind grows tired of carrying fear from one season into the next, and eventually, whether through suffering, exhaustion, or quiet awakening, many people begin realizing something profound. The real battle was never only external, it was internal, a battle over consciousness itself. Because the way a person experiences life is deeply shaped by the mental and emotional atmosphere they continuously inhabit. And according to the metaphysical teachings of Emmet, outer conditions often begin changing only after consciousness itself begins changing first. This is why gratitude matters so deeply, not as performance, not as forced positivity, not as a denial of pain, but as a deliberate reorientation away from fear and back toward divine presence. Most people spend years waiting for life to improve before allowing themselves to feel thankful. They unconsciously say, "When things finally change, then I will feel peace. When the money comes, then I will relax. When the pain disappears, then I will trust life again." But this creates a dangerous dependency, because if inner peace depends entirely upon external conditions, then consciousness remains permanently vulnerable to instability, and life, by its nature, is always changing. Conditions rise and fall, people come and go, success appears and disappears, the future remains uncertain. No external situation can permanently sustain inner stability. This is why spiritual maturity begins when gratitude stops depending entirely upon circumstances. The grateful person does not ignore difficulty. They simply refuse to surrender consciousness completely to it. And this changes everything. Because the moment gratitude enters the mind, even quietly, fear loses total control over perception. A person facing uncertainty may still feel concern, but now they also remember strength, previous survival lessons, learned, unseen possibilities, support that still exists, life that still continues, moving. And this remembrance transforms emotional reality from within. This is why the practice we explored throughout this audiobook is so deceptively powerful. Before asking, give thanks first. Not because God demands ritual, but because gratitude transforms the consciousness that is praying. The fearful mind approaches life emotionally collapsed. The grateful mind approaches life open. And openness changes perception. A closed mind sees endings everywhere. An open mind continues recognizing movement. A fearful consciousness sees only obstacles. A grateful consciousness notices pathways. A resentful consciousness expects abandonment. A grateful consciousness remains receptive to guidance. This is not blind optimism. It is spiritual alignment. And alignment affects every dimension of human experience: emotional resilience, perception, intuition, decision-making, relationships, creativity, openness to opportunity. Even the nervous system responds differently. Fear contracts the body into survival mode. The mind narrows around danger. Breathing changes. Emotional rigidity increases. But gratitude softens contraction. The body relaxes slightly. Awareness expands again. The mind becomes less imprisoned by catastrophic thinking. And once consciousness reopens, life begins feeling different internally, even before external conditions fully change. This is one of the greatest hidden truths most people overlook. The first transformation is almost always invisible. It begins within consciousness itself. A calmer mind, a softer emotional state, a renewed sense of possibility, a subtle return of hope, a willingness to continue. And from this new internal atmosphere, the individual begins moving through reality differently, speaking differently, responding differently, praying differently. Eventually, even opportunities that once seemed invisible begin appearing more clearly. Not because gratitude magically manipulates the universe, but because consciousness is no longer fully consumed by fear. This is why many spiritually grounded people remain surprisingly calm during seasons that emotionally overwhelm others. It is not because their lives are perfect. It is because they no longer worship appearances. They understand something deeper. Conditions are temporary, but consciousness shapes how those conditions are experienced. And once a person truly understands this, prayer itself begins changing. Prayer stops becoming desperate begging. It becomes a conscious alignment. The individual no longer approaches God entirely from emotional starvation. Instead, they begin recognizing what still exists even during imperfection. Thank God I am still breathing. Thank God I still have the strength to continue. Thank God life has not abandoned me. Thank God. Possibility still exists beyond what I can currently see. This kind of gratitude does something extraordinary. It restores a relationship with trust, not certainty about every outcome. Trust. Trust that life may still contain movements invisible to the fearful mind. Trust that divine intelligence may still be operating beyond present appearances. Trust that temporary darkness is not final reality. And perhaps this is the true purpose of gratitude, not to ignore life, but to see it more completely. Because fear sees only what is threatened. Gratitude sees what still remains alive. Fear sees endings. Gratitude remembers continuation. Fear psychologically freezes consciousness inside present appearances. But gratitude quietly reminds the soul, life is still moving, even now, especially now. So before you ask for more, before you pray for the next door to open, before you beg life to change, pause, breathe. Look carefully at what still remains, the strength you survived with, the lessons of pain revealed, the people who stayed. The opportunities are still unseen. The breath is still moving through your body. The simple miracle of being alive another day. And then, before asking for anything else, give thanks. Because gratitude does not merely change emotion, it changes consciousness. And once consciousness changes, the entire experience of life begins changing with it.